All right, so our next talk is No Disassembly Required, Brian Satira with Redoubt.
Okay. Can everybody, hold on a second. Can everybody still hear me? Is that, all right. We'll try this microphone, and if it doesn't work, I'll switch back to the other microphone. Okay. Yeah, if somebody can grab the doors. So I am Brian Satira, and this is No Disassembly Required, which is a terrible pun and fully intended. As the subject of this talk, we'll be talking about script-based malware, but it's also going to be kind of an exhortation, if you're not a malware analyst, to not be afraid to start doing malware analysis. So I'll talk a little bit about some VBS malware, talk about some offensive PowerShell, and some other types of script-based malware. The important parts up front, you can follow me on Twitter at Redoubt with a 3. My GitHub page, I have a number of open source projects that I'm working on and are starting up and running. Over the past year, I've done a lot of Mac OS related security stuff. So I have some free scripts up there for hardening Mac OS and some other materials related to that, previous talks I've given. And you can follow me on my blog at blog.redoubt.io, again with a 3, which again, currently is mostly some Mac security related stuff. If anybody's interested in that and using OS query for EDR, I have some tutorials up on that. But the stuff from the training yesterday and from this talk will kind of be going up on there as a series of blogs, hopefully soon. So a little bit about me. Not really, I usually kind of like the idea that, a talk should kind of stand on its own. Don't believe in like the lab coat commercial philosophy, right? Well, I'm standing in a lab coat, so buy our product. But just because people have asked me, like yesterday at the training that we did, how did you become a malware analyst, or how do I become a malware analyst, or how did you get started in security? Brief bit of background. So I am originally from Pittsburgh, got out of the military, went back to school on GI Bill. University of Pittsburgh had an information security program at their School of Information Science, like a graduate program, went back to do that, but really ended up getting into what I do now, doing an internship with NCFTA, which I know there's some people here today with NCFTA or who are NCFTA alums as well. Where I got to work with federal law enforcement and see what they do, and started just learning by doing, right? So way before your tax dollars paid for me to go to a $5,000 SANS course with Lenny Zeltzer, thank you, as a government malware analyst, I was just learning by doing as, a guy working as an intern, unpaid intern, who was told, go learn C, go write a Hello World C program, compile it and throw the assembly in IDAPRO or Ollie and see what it does, right? So, and since then, I've done kind of an InfoSec jack of all trades. So I do have some background in intelligence, like as an intel analyst. So I've helped stand up some threat intel programs. And done a variety of other things too, but I consider myself mainly a reverse engineer. And I say a reverse engineer instead of a malware analyst, in part because I've probably split my work 50-50 working on industrial control systems and embedded stuff from a vulnerability analyst standpoint, so more offensive oriented, but also kind of as a philosophical point, in that I think it's more than just bug hunting, or in the case of malware analysis, throwing something in a sandbox and finding quote unquote IOCs, getting indicators of compromise. It's really understanding, what does something really do? Not what the person who wrote the code thinks it does, not what you originally at the outset thought it did, but what can it really do? What does it really do? How does it really work? And that's kind of the essence of hacking, right? Is discovering what things can really do. So, is this talk for you? So, by a show of hands, regardless of what your job title is, how many people here have ever, or on a relatively routine basis, get asked to look at phishing emails? Okay, how many people get asked to do sort of EDR even if it's just your Joe help desk and, hey, go re-image this box, right? Okay, now out of all those people, feel free to put your hands back up and put them down. How many of you, if this is not the case, how many of you, your company just says, oh, you want to go take a $6,000 SANS course, or you want 10 grand to go fly out to Vegas to go to Black Hat? No problem. Anybody? So a few people. And I've been lucky enough that I've had companies, both working on the government side and or certain companies that I work for, where I had the opportunity to do that. Usually because I controlled a budget and paid myself to go do that. But not everybody does, right? And out of all the people who raised your hands, how many of you, your actual title is you're a malware analyst? Okay, so not as many, right? So my point that I'm trying to get across with this talk is just, maybe you don't know where to start. Maybe your idea of malware analysis is, well, I'm not a malware analyst. I don't have the right tools. I don't have the right environment. I don't have the training, the certifications. I can't really do anything other than just throw stuff in a sandbox. And, really all you need is the curiosity and persistence. And the persistence is not to be underestimated, right? Unless you have the persistence almost to the point of masochism, of I'm going to do a really hard Sudoku puzzle or crossword puzzle and get to the end and realize I have to start over. That's the type of persistence I'm talking about. Really you just have to want to learn. And I would say bottom line up front for anybody who suddenly has to go take a phone call or whatever, like they always say, tell people what you're going to tell them and then tell them what you told them. Start with script-based malware. This was an epiphany that actually I kind of had, but really I'll credit a friend of mine and former coworker had when we were talking. A malware analyst, one of the better ones I've known, had the epiphany that 10 years ago, or if we could tell somebody today, like, where should you start? You only have one day to train somebody, that sort of thing, that we would have, before we did the whole learning C and Windows API and Windows internals and spending a lot of time staring at assembly and IDA, we would have started with script-based malware, or scripts, right? So, and it's just sort of the most bang for the buck. The second point I would make is that it's not magic, it's just code. So even if you say, I'm not a developer, I've never written a line of code in my life, write a hello world script. Pick a scripting language. I guarantee you, and if you already know something, stick with that. I guarantee you there's malware written in it. I mean, how many people here are Lua developers? Nobody, right? Can anyone here, by show of hands, even familiar with anything vaguely important written in Lua? It's like maybe a handful of people. And out of any of those people, is your answer not World of Warcraft mods? The other thing would be a bunch of Stuxnet and some related stuff, related implants. But there's been plenty of malware written in Lua, and it's a pretty obscure language. Doesn't require any special software, right? It's literally all you need is a VM and Notepad or some text editor, and you can analyze script-based malware. It's not going to be the ideal environment. Maybe there are some other things that would help, but as you're going to see, that's really about as basic as it gets. And and you're smarter than a sandbox. So if I had like a single tagline for this talk, it's that you are, as a blue teamer, as a defender, regardless of what you think you're capable of doing, you are smarter than a sandbox. And malware authors aren't stupid, right? They're putting in all sorts of anti-forensics. They might have fake callouts. They might have, a weight that you don't know about. And if all you ever did was detonate something in a sandbox and then go, oh yeah, I got the IOCs, we got this domain and that domain. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you didn't get the right payload. Maybe you didn't get the right C2. You might not actually know that unless you've really looked at the malware and done some manual analysis. And that's not to say that automation doesn't have its place, right, for triage and things like that, but it should be the first step and just that triage step, right? Okay, so enough on the soapbox. I said that this was going to be your most bang for the buck. So this is kind of the Pareto Principle. Anybody here familiar with the Pareto Principle? maybe a few people. So this is Alfredo Pareto. He was an Italian economist, clearly a wise, incredible man based on his beard. Um, it's actually an apocryphal attribution that I've only ever heard from people with MBAs or like from a business school background. As somebody with an economics degree once upon a time, it's not an actual economics thing, and they think that it's like an apocryphal attribution by an engineer. He did come up with Pareto optimality, which is a real thing in like game theory, but that's a whole other talk. My other nerd out area of expertise. So the idea is 20% of the effort to get 80% of the return, right? So why not do that up front and start seeing an immediate ROI? When I train interns or I've trained like new malware analysts, this is now like my standard approach because I can get them immediately doing useful work and feeling confident and feeling like they know how to do something, right? Rather than having somebody stumble around learning assembly. So phishing email attachments, drive-by downloads, live off the land activity. How many people have heard that buzzword, right? That's sort of like been the flavor of the month for a lot of months now. So scripts, what are they good for? Everybody here familiar with MITRE ATT&CK model or like Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain? Whatever model you want to use to kind of look at attacker behavior, most of your stages or activities are something that an attacker can do with script-based malware of some sort without portable executable files. And in many cases today may be doing without compiled binaries, just because of that live off the land principle of using components that are going to be whitelisted, things that are going to be kind of found, tools that systems administrators use, and so on and so forth. So let me start by getting into right into an example of this, and that's Visual Basic Scripting and phishing emails. So it would not be a malware talk without a little bit of the Wayback Machine talking about malware that nobody remembers. Maybe some people in the room do remember I Love You Worm. It was one of the first really big phishing email campaigns, like mass mailer sort of thing. And it was just two students from the Philippines who wrote this in VBS. And this is just a part of the code, the main method, or the main function and sub in the script. But it's estimated it affected something like 45 million users around the world unintentionally, and this wasn't really a deliberate part of what the malware was supposed to do, but it was just so successful that when it was going around looking at people's email Outlook contacts and then remailing it copies of itself as an attachment, as a phishing attachment, it ended up crashing Outlook servers and being like a denial of service attack on huge companies and governments around the world. And it was pretty malicious, despite the claims of the two students that wrote it. It looked for document and other specific file extensions and overwrote things, so it was pretty destructive. The point is, it was written in VBS, and it was written in VBS with API code that, standard code that is still around in Windows 10, or some version of it. It might be a new CLSID and a new version of something, but it's like the same COM objects are still to be found on a Windows system today. And so, in terms of that MITRE attack, we're talking about initial access, or we're talking about initial delivery and installation. There's still stuff around today. I've looked at phishing emails in the past year that were not really that similar from something like I Love You Worm, other than the fact that they were heavily obfuscated, which it did not have to be because there wasn't anybody looking to detect it. So 18 years later, still pwning strong, which in a certain sense is kind of depressing. In another sense, though, I think kind of makes the point that I was trying to make about the value of starting with scripts and learning something very simple can help solve a lot of problems, or help give you a lot of capability. So today, primarily, you're going to see these types of VBS scripts used for staging payloads rather than as necessarily the main payload. And what I mean by that, for those who aren't familiar, is either droppers or downloaders. So a dropper, might have an embedded executable, not necessarily in a VBS context, but I remember a couple of years ago it was a thing where people were using to compile .NET files, and the actual payload was just a variable that contained, an encoded or encrypted string, and they were just using it as a carrier file to get around defenses, and specifically as an anti-forensics against sandboxes. Downloaders, right? So it might just be a short snippet of VBS using a handful of COM objects to go out and download the real payload, and or it could the real payload could be scripts. But so why would we do this? This is making things a little bit more complicated than it needs to be. Well, think about it this way: would you rather, right? If you've got your new cool banking Trojan written in C or C++ or whatever, and it took you 6 months to write, or you paid for it from some guy in the Ukraine who it took him 6 months to write, do you want that to get burned if your phishing email campaign goes sideways? Or would you rather just have a JavaScript downloader that took you a half hour to write get burned, and that be the end of it? And of course, cybercrime, is a business, and there's not always vertical integration. So I might be just delivering payload for a client, and I want it to be sort of agnostic, right? And then the defensive agent, which I kind of already mentioned. So as I said, in terms of tools, really, you're just starting with a text editor and a VM. Now, I would recommend using more of a full-featured text editor, something like Notepad++, that is intended for developers, especially people who do scripting a lot, and where you can kind of set it to a particular scripting language, and it'll highlight all the keywords that it recognizes as being associated with that scripting language. But that's not necessary. You could just use Notepad or something, or gedit or whatever. VI, if you're really adventurous. No VI Vim fans. Okay, that was a joke. I would smash my hand in a car door before I analyzed malware with VI. Yeah. So. Of course, internet access, we always want to be safe. Don't have your VM set to a bridged or NATed connection. I ran into this yesterday with the training. There were some folks who really didn't quite get the concept of host-only networks and were asking questions about that. So I'm not trying to oversimplify things, but some people are not clear on that. I generally don't use real debuggers for most of the script malware because a lot of it is just simple downloaders, and they're not real extensive. I generally haven't found a super big need to use like a full-featured debugger. But if you did want to, like if you install Microsoft Visual Studio, there is with C-script, exe, and like WScript, there's an option like a /x that you can run a VBS script in like a real debugger mode. And I think set points and things like that. I don't do that. My poor man's debugger is just using message box. So in VBS, if you you'll see it in a minute, but if you just put things in a message box, you can get an immediate feed out or output and feedback of what the code was doing. Similar thing if you're working with malicious JavaScript, you're just using like an alert box, right? General strategy for these VBS downloader phishing emails, you've got to first extract it from source, and sometimes this is the hardest part, and that's a whole talk unto itself. It's a whole talk for another day, but and I'll go through I'll go through some of it in my example that we have coming up here in a minute, but it's generally going to involve extracting like an OLE object from extracting something from a Word document and carving it out, and then getting it into your text editor. Finding unobfuscated code, keywords, and cleaning up line break, and generally cleaning up the code. So in VBS, you'll have the whole script will be shoved together with colons, which act as like a line continuation. And so breaking those out just so it's more readable. And then, as I said, if you're using something like Notepad++, anything that's unobfuscated, which there's always going to be some code that they've left unobfuscated, it's going to go ahead and highlight that for you, and that gives you like a better starting point, right, of determining, hey, this is where a function starts and stops or something like that, even if I can't read what it does. Sometimes IOCs are just in plain text, as you'll see a little bit later, but as I said, don't believe it because you don't know what type of anti-forensics are going on. Try finding eval or execute functions and substituting them with message box. That's like the go-to first step. I would say maybe 25%, something less than 50%, but a sizable chunk of VBS malware. You can defeat the obfuscation just with that, right? Because they're being lazy. They just want to avoid basic detection, and they're just running everything through eval. And you can do the same thing too, and just output with message box the unobfuscated copy of the code. Get rid of obvious garbage functions. Look for the decoder or deobfuscation functions because they have to be in the sample somewhere. Maybe possibly if this was like a second stage to some other malware, there might be some other component that does the decoding and decrypting, but generally you're going to have some type of decoder function like that, the simplest method being that eval statement that's going to be in the malware itself. So if you can find that first, you can write a quick decoder in whatever scripting language you're comfortable with. It doesn't have to be the same scripting language. I mean, I've had people ask me that. Just because I'm looking at VBS doesn't mean that I can't use Python to write my decoder. And especially if I'm seeing the same type of thing over and over again and the same type of phishing emails over and over again, you might start to have a payoff to writing those decoders and making them a little more robust. Identify the really useful bits. It's typically going to be really common or run-of-the-mill same COM objects over and over again that you'll see. And we'll see all this coming up in the example. Renaming functions to something meaningful and commenting your code. This is even more important in malware analysis than it is in being a developer, because ultimately you have to communicate your results and your information to someone else for your work to be of value, whether that's reporting to management, whether that's talking to threat intel guys who aren't as technical as you are, or whether that's communicating information so you can write a Yara rule or a signature for an IDS or something. So you want to, right off the bat, start commenting your code as you go and renaming things in a way that's going to help that. And I think the MITRE attack model or something along those lines is a good way to standardize your language and terminology when you do that. Establishing sequence of files and processes, noting anti-forensics. The only thing I'll hit on here is this last point. It's a little bit of a soapbox point, but that observables are not indicators. So, I once got an Excel spreadsheet from an analyst at a Fortune 500 SOC that was more or less just a big list of IPs. And I was kind of like, he was like, did you get those indicators? Yeah, so are these IP addresses, hosting second stage payloads? Is this a C2 server? What is this, right? It's that context that makes an indicator and actionable. And so again, when you're making your notes and you're saying I'm trying to find IOCs, make sure you're finding actual IOCs and have all the information. Sorry, soapbox point. So let's go through an example. I think this is going to be a little bit more clear. VBS downloader. So phishing email was received, forwarded to security to an organization. It was embedded in a Word document. The Word document was password protected. So going back to anti-forensics, we had a cuckoo-based sandbox farm set up that we could throw samples through. And we were actually more using that for kind of threat emulation and helping develop blue team tactics than operationally focused malware analysis. But the point is that kind of broke that model, right? And broke the idea of just detonating it in Cuckoo, even though we had Cuckoo sandboxes set up with Word, Office in them, and we typically could just detonate Office documents and get information. So I used MSM SOC which is an MS OLE, or excuse me, an MS password removal tool. There are a number of them out there. This is just a free one that I think has a GitHub page. And then carved out the script in from Word. I think in this case, it was easy enough to do it once it was decrypted or decompressed. The password protection was removed to do it with a hex editor. But you may do that with some other tools like Baldwin's Office Mouse Scanner, or the Decollage. I forget the actual name of the tool, but the site is Decollage, that have the OLE extractor tool that they have. You can Google for them. This is a little, and then it was just a matter of starting the basic cleanup. So as I said, to kind of focus on the actual script part, because that first part is sort of its own art form as well. On the right here, you can see that is the obfuscated copy, where I've just done an initial cleanup of breaking out those line continuations so that it's a little bit more readable. And you can see that Notepad++ has identified functions. And so I'm able to say, okay, this is a function. And here's the name of the function. It's not a human readable name. It's sort of a garbage name. But I can highlight that and then search to see, is this function even called anywhere else in the script? And if not, it's probably just garbage code there to distract me. And I can delete it out, at least out of a copy of the script, and start working from that assumption. And I'm gradually reducing the stuff I actually have to look at, right? So after I've eliminated some of the garbage code, I'm going through deobfuscation. So I've identified this function, which you can see up there, which is actually 3 functions that were the main obfuscation functions, or I should say deobfuscation functions, to undo what they had done in the script. The top one was just a modulus function that they implemented themselves for some reason, probably just to avoid having that VBS keyword in the file plain text. I don't really know, but that's what they did, and they just did some math operations on strings that they had converted from a character to the number value of the character, and so they were doing math operations on them. An XOR function that they did, that they were using, well, we'll see what it was used for in a second, and then the main decode function that was used for the main obfuscation of like the body of the code. And so then from there, I was able to take that main deobfuscation function and write a quick decoder and start clearing up the useful code that actually did something and it wasn't junk code. And as I said, I came up with some fairly common COM objects. So in this case, they're creating an XML HTTP object. So typically you're going to see either that or you're going to see an Internet Explorer object being created sort of as a headless browser to go out and pull down some other content. That's a pretty good indication. Or potentially to push information up to a C2 server, but it's more often, as in this case, a downloader. And yeah, I don't know if you can see this, but in the open statement, they're using a get request method. And then that QV70 I probably should have renamed for this, just for this screenshot for everybody, but that was the URL. So I was then able to find that they had a function that was essentially doing a URL chooser. It wasn't exactly like a domain generation algorithm, but it was just choosing from a list of hard-coded URLs to use. And there were some anti-forensics measures beyond that, like wait times and things like that. So if I had just thrown this into a sandbox and rolled with the first thing I got, or had been running like FakeNet NG or something, I might have gotten a domain name that wasn't even being used actively by the attacker. Or I may have gotten one that was no longer being used, or whatever the case may be. I would not have gotten all of the URLs, all of those out of the file. And then the XOR function was actually discovered was not being used, and you can see this at the bottom. There was a selection mechanism for what byte key to use, and just level set here for everybody. If you're not familiar, I mean, XOR is one of the more common methods of obfuscation, simple obfuscation that people use. And it's pretty convenient because, as I said, whatever you do, you have to undo. So if I have converted things to a number and then I XOR, if I XOR a byte stream, right? by some byte key, and then I XOR it again by the same byte key, I get back, anybody? The same thing I started with, right? It's kind of convenient that way. So this was just their method of decoding the payload that they were going out and getting. So in order to decode those payloads, when I would go out and curl the second stage or use some manner to go out and get the second stage, and if you're going to do that curl, kind of keying on the red team talk that just happened, I'd note to people that if you use, you can use tools like curl and set up your own profile so that you're not just using the default header. Like, that's basic practice. You should be creating a spoofed header with a spoofed user agent and all that stuff so that you don't look like a blue teamer going out and getting a second stage payload. You look like a victim. Yeah, so then it was able to decode the second stage payload. So lessons learned. Dynamic analysis would have missed stuff. You need those XOR keys. It was able to recover those. And it's just this reuse of basic COM objects, like a handful of COM objects. It was this. You can see the file system object in the second part. And typically some type of WScript shell object, because you can use those to do a headless command line. And run files with an argument to it, that sort of thing. Edit registry keys, so on and so forth. So if you learn in like JavaScript, let's say, or VBS, you learn the example code. You look at ss64.com or MSDN, and you look at APIs, and you look at how to use a basic set of maybe 4 or 5 different COM objects. The ones I just named being most of them. You can A do B stream objects would be the other. You can pretty much understand and identify the important parts of the vast majority of like VBS or JavaScript download or phishing email code that you're going to look at. So you don't have to be 100% proficient expert in VBS. You just have to be able to recognize those important parts and kind of understand how they work. This was just some stuff that I think I've already kind of covered about string manipulations and character manipulations with the ASC key. You would see the opposite of it. The undoing of it is going to be done with the reversing of that is going to be done with a CHR, with that character function to get it back to a character. That's an example of this dim foo. They're just storing in that variable. The whole script is a big long string, and then running it through execute. And so this is one of those cases where, as I said, if I just substitute execute with message box, I get the deobfuscated script. So rolling right along, PowerShell scripting, try and knock through this. Sure, everybody here is familiar with PowerShell. Anybody not familiar with PowerShell? Right? No? Okay, good. So, basic idea was more bash-like experience, more powerful for systems administration features like command.exe, but blue. 2012 was sort of the year of PowerShell. I mean, PowerShell came out in 2006, but the offensive PowerShell use really kicked off in high gear 2012 with all these big talks at Black Hat and DerbyCon, DEF CON, all the conferences. You had Dave Kennedy and Josh Kelly, who I think there's actually another E in his name, I misspelled it, doing their talk, the OMFG talk at Black Hat. Matt Graber, you had tools coming out like PowerSploit, followed by Empire and Nishang and so on and so forth. And Red Team really has sort of led the way on this philosophy and this live off the land methodology. But the advanced persistent threat actors and various actual malicious actors have adopted the same techniques because they work and because there are all of these legitimate InfoSec professionals doing all the development work for them. And this chart on the right was just to show that, again, with PowerShell, we can do pretty much all the stuff that we need to do. And especially in that middle box, which is this sort of actions on objectives in the CKC terminology, this is where the offensive PowerShell really shines, right? And that lateral movement, privilege escalation, so on and so forth. And so, I mean, how many people here have not heard the term like live off the land or fileless intrusions, usually in the sales pitch of some vendor who claims they can detect it and defend it and defeat it and make you cappuccino. Live off the land, really how I sort of interpret it is using whitelisted applications, tools, scripting engines, stuff that your admins use so that it doesn't look unusual. You're making a smaller footprint. You're making a smaller footprint for EDR. You have fewer artifacts on the endpoint. You're not writing as much stuff to file. And you also have fewer artifacts that you're downloading that are going to be in network traffic. Fileless intrusion, I think to the extent that it has a meaning beyond a buzzword or a sales pitch, is just this idea that we're writing fewer artifacts to disk. And PowerShell is sort of uniquely capable of that because of the remote management features that it has. So I can run a PowerShell script on my system or on a system that I'm using as a pivot point and run it on a remote host. And it's not going to I don't have to write the file to disk on that system. It's going to be in memory. And maybe if they have script block logging enabled, they're going to catch it in script block logs in like a Windows event 4104, which I'll get to in a second here. And so these are some of the basic methods that you commonly see. Again, one of the advantages is with like the invoke command, you can run this not just against one target, you can run it against multiple target hosts. The term cradles, so I'm sure people here have heard maybe the term like PowerShell cradles and wondered exactly what that means, other than jargon and buzzwords. This came out of like Raphael Mudge's talk in 2015, the Flying a Cylon Raider, which you can read the PDF version from SANS of that. This is a great example you're commonly going to see, right? Is this invoke expression, which that's aliased, and then creating a .NET web client, as I kind of had in my previous slide. You've got access to everything .NET natively. So, and commonly used, we're going to use the download string method instead of a download file method, just because it allows me to do that running of a remote, grab that remotely hosted PowerShell script and run it without writing it to disk first on the local system. And of course, other tools were adapted to take advantage of that. So the invoke Mimikatz version of running Mimikatz. One of so putting this in context, where you may see stuff like this getting used, if you're looking at phishing emails, since a lot of people said that they looked at phishing emails, would be in HTA files. Anybody here run into like malicious HTA phishing emails? I see a few heads nodding and some people putting hands in the air. Yeah, so in 2017, there was a CVE 2017-199, which really wasn't a bug or anything. It was just Microsoft functionality that could be abused, which is always the best part. And that's why I said in the beginning of my talk, reverse engineering is more than just finding a bug, right? Sometimes it's a feature. And this allowed HTA files to just be opened in a Word file and was billed as like macroless exploit of Word documents with HTA. This has since been closed down. That loophole has sort of been closed down by Microsoft. But there's still other methods to execute HTAs. They're still used by attackers. One thing is it's a defensive evasion measure because you're using a whitelisted legitimate application, mshta.exe, to launch some other malicious content. To look for this, by the way, in Windows event logs, 4656 queries to HTA related CLS IDs, and your 4688 process creation from SHTA would be one way to start. This is an actual malicious HTA downloader that, courtesy Nick Carr from Daily Scriptlet guy, if anybody follows him, I would recommend it, that he got emailed from somebody else, another malware researcher. And it's just kind of humorous because this is how not to obfuscate an HTA file or any other malware. So you can see some of the similar stuff you saw in the earlier VBS script, but they've heavily obfuscated it. They're using PowerShell in sort of the middle part for the downloader. They have this PowerShell cradle, and then they've decided to, for some reason, not obfuscate the IOCs, like the stuff that we would really be looking for, right? And you would still want to go ahead and deobfuscate this just to make sure that this isn't messing with you in some sort of anti-forensics. But this gives you a good look at what the functionality would be. So I've got my HTML, and then enclosed within my HTML, I've got a VB script. And the VB script is really being used to do the filing and handling of writing and running the file, which they're temporarily storing into an environmental variable and then pulling it back out again. And the actual downloading is being done with the download file method of that .NET web client object. Why they chose to do this instead of doing a one-liner with the download string, I'm not 100% certain, but that's what they did. So again, it's not too different from what you saw in the earlier VBS file, but they're using PowerShell for that download or cradle. We could sit here and talk for an hour just about, or more, or weeks. Well, I couldn't because I don't know a week worth of material, but there are people who do, like Daniel Bohannon, on PowerShell obfuscation. It's a lot of the same games. There's aliased expressions or aliased commandlets, base64 encoding, as you can see on the right, using tick marks, concatenations, your -f format feature is a really common string manipulation that you see with the PowerShell. And at the end of the day, there's too many to cover here. At the end of the day, the big point I would make is just that it led to this PowerShell arms race, and you had the some really top researchers like Daniel Bohannon from Mandiant and Lee Holmes with Microsoft and Microsoft Azure, who was one of the people who originally wrote PowerShell script in PowerShell, getting into this cat and mouse game with who could create even more complicated obfuscations, and Microsoft introducing security features with each version of PowerShell. So that's really behooves you to use 5.1, or if you're getting into using Linux systems as well, version 6 engine, because it builds in just enough administration, script block logging, and so forth. And on the left, you can see that script block being caught with a 4014 Windows event log, which you would not catch if people were running their PowerShell. Your administrators are using like V2 of PowerShell, or the attacker has successfully downgraded to V2. And so that becomes another thing to look for, as you're looking for the downgrade instead of the malicious activity itself, at least as a starting point. And then, of course, you have the end of the PowerShell arms race Cold War with Daniel Bohannon and Lee Holmes coming together in 2017 and doing like the revoke obfuscation and revoke obfuscation talks. And that's a really useful tool that I would recommend. And basically their point that they arrived at was that it's so hard to manually deobfuscate some of the stuff you can create in terms of PowerShell obfuscation that you almost need to adopt more of a logs and statistical analysis based approach. And that's a part of what their tool does, is it facilitates that in reassembling scripts that span multiple logs. Other malware, really quick, since we are ticking down the clock. Thought I would mention this one, Mac OS malware. So this just shows you the scope of what you can do just looking at script malware. So last year, 2017, one of the big news items in Mac OS malware, if people follow that stuff, with Patrick Wardle, I would also recommend, like Chris Ross from Spectre Ops is a good guy on that stuff, was this fruit fly malware, as they called it. And you had all these InfoSec blogs and researchers who rushed out. And this is clearly some never before seen, really stealthy APT actor who was targeting very specifically the biotech sector. And they had these complicated theories based on, well, it was found on this professor's laptop and this university and so on and so forth. And of course, as it turns out, it was really just this disgruntled software engineer from Cleveland and named Filthy Phil Jurachinski. And he has not been convicted, but he has been charged with 16 counts of everything you can do naughty with a computer. And he was probably a Browns fan, so is this really surprising? And the point is that he infected systems like at police departments and on US government systems and had persistence for years on some of the systems, as far as anybody could tell. Why? He was using one of the most low-hanging fruit, no pun intended, persistence mechanisms you can use on Mac OS, which is just a plist item in launch D. But nobody was looking for him, and nobody really knew how to look for him, and nobody was analyzing his malware, and it was just Perl script. So he was able to create a completely workable rat entirely in Perl script. So there you go. And in really old libraries of Perl script, that was what piqued people's interest. They thought it was some sort of anti-forensics stealth measure or something that he was using out-of-date code. Malicious JavaScript, that's a whole week worth of material. I would refer you to OWASP. I think there was like kind of an OWASP talk this morning. But JavaScript was intended to be able to do client-side dynamic content for web content. And so you can just as easily dynamically create bad stuff, right? And tiny web shells, same thing. Last-ditch effort backdoor, doing government work. I've seen this a lot with APT actors targeting government organizations. That is their backdoor of last resort after they've been kicked off a network, is leaving behind, it could be as small with like China Chopper is a 4K file with just a simple PHP code in it to receive commands and run commands on the web server. And it's just a toehold. It's just, propping open the back door while you ransack the house, just in case, right? So my final caveat I'll leave you with. So I would say that it is the 20% that gets you the 80% looking at script malware, and I would encourage everybody to start there. But if you're going to be a full-time malware analyst, if you want to go work in a shop where all you do is sit and go through a queue of malware sample after malware sample, you probably do want to get your GREM if you can. You want to learn C, learn C++ and assembly, maybe even ARM as opposed to just x86, 64. If you're going to start looking at like Android malware or something. And start to recognize control flow. So write your own hello world file, compile it in different compilers, and then look at the difference in the assembly when you open it up in IDAPRO or Ollie Debug, and you'll see the differences that are just artifacts of compilers, right? What is the calling convention? Who cleans up the stack? Is it the calling function or is it the callee? And that's going to vary from compiler to compiler. That's Ocean Lotus Rat. It's a Mac OS Mach O binary in IDA. And it's just a random gratuitous disassembler shot. You have to have one of those in a malware talk or it's not a malware talk. Learn file formats. Like I said, learn to use disassemblers and debuggers, but start with scripts. And for most of us who your job title is not malware analyst, but you are a malware analyst. You're being asked to do it. You're being asked to look at malicious phishing emails. Take a little bit of time, and if you're able to, or make the time, and just start scripting. Start writing scripts and looking at your own scripts. Start with those basic com functions or com objects that I talked about, like the ones that create web objects, XML, HTTP, and how to do that, or the Internet Explorer object. And so again, it's not magic, it's just code. All you really need is a VM and a text editor and some persistence, and you are smarter than a sandbox. So you can do it. And I wish it was as easy. I love Dilbert, but I wish it was as easy as, just getting a software engineer to write an app for that, but there's no magic bullet. It's just persistence of doing it. That's how you become a malware analyst. Special thanks, like I said, just a shout out to Adam Swan, and you can follow those guys, and Nate Quageni. You can follow them on Twitter. They're big elk stack, blue teamer guys and malware analysts who do cool stuff as well and help contribute to this talk. And these are some of the blogs that I follow or Twitter feeds that I follow of people who are relevant to what I just talked about and who do a lot of good work on what I just talked about. And I'll put the slides up at some point, like as a PDF on my GitHub page, which we kind of saw at the beginning, and that's just Redoubt with a 3. And if you need to find me, the easiest way to Google for it is applesauce in a bucket, because that's my Apple security repository, and it seems to be the one that pops up in Google. Any questions? We have just a minute or something left here.
You got 5 minutes of notes.
Yeah. Questions? Yes.
So, you talk a lot about interference, right? And like figuring out a script that's possibly managing the set around and familiarizing yourself. to mod programs, super programs, doing it very verified.
Yeah. So to speak to that point really quickly, two things. Okay. Number one, yeah, there are sites you can go out to, websites that will obfuscate or de-obfuscate stuff for you automatically. They don't always work. And more importantly, if you're doing this for reals for stuff from your company and this is stuff you've gotten, it's just a matter of basic OPSEC that you don't want to go out and just paste that into an online tool and you don't know who's running that site or why they're running it and what they're doing. It's kind of like just saying, well, I can just take the samples and upload them all to VirusTotal, right? It's an OPSEC thing. It depends on why you're doing the analysis and so on and so forth. And in terms of getting your hands dirty, I mean, so the people who did the training yesterday, we did a whole training. I had them start out by writing scripts rather than trying to de-obfuscate real samples. And that would be my recommendation, right? So if you're not, you just said, if you're not a coder, okay, I would start out by not trying to de-obfuscate obfuscated samples that some malware author has written. I would start out by writing my own really simple downloader with 2 VMs and having an Apache server with a text file on it, and writing my own VBS or JavaScript downloader that downloads a file and understanding that functionality. And then when you start to look at obfuscated stuff, you'll recognize, even though it's quote unquote obfuscated, you're going to recognize the basic structure of what's going on. Does that help answer your question?
Sure. Does your answer change if the tool is not online?
Yeah, sure. So that would be the right way to do it if you're using an automated tool, would be to make sure you had a local copy. Yep. And like I said, that may not always work though, right? Any other questions? Okay. Thank you.